it. Let's talk about some of the other stories in the papers today. Nathaniel Ogunniyi, the political commentator with Young Voices UK, is here. Nathaniel, good morning.
Good morning, Rosie.
Front page of the Times says the Prime Minister is going to go to Canada later on this week to discuss security and economic cooperation with Mark Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada. How does the Prime Minister navigate this? On one hand, his relationship with Donald Trump, but also closer ties with Canada.
So I guess it's good for the UK to work quite closely with Canada. We are two countries that are members of a number of international organizations, OECD, NATO, G7, G20, Commonwealth, all that kind of stuff. So we have those close ties that sort of bind us on one side. On the other, of course, the UK is the only country to have negotiated an opt-out from the tariffs that Trump is currently imposing on everyone else, particularly on the steel imports that have gone up to 50%. Canada and indeed every other country have been unable to secure an exemption from those. And so I guess the Prime Minister is sort of riding two horses, right? He's sort of trying to remain close to our Commonwealth allies. And of course, we share a king with Canada. But on the other side, you sort of have the economic relationship with the US, which is numerically speaking just on another scale, right? They're just far more economically important.
It's extreme. I think, yes, trying to ride those two horses at the same time, I think is going to get increasingly difficult. The EU's considering having closer ties with Canada. Obviously, Canada's a NATO member, key donor to Ukraine. They've got principles sort of in line with things that we as well also care about.
Yes, and I suppose the nature of that relationship is that the Starmer and the Canadian Prime Minister are the only sort of two centre-left leaders in the G7. So the EU are trying to become closer to Canada. We're trying to get closer to Canada too. So it's sort of, I think a lot of countries looking at the way that Trump has reshaped America's relationships with the rest of the world means that they have sort of tried to reshape their alliances, and Canada is sort of a natural port of call for a good number of them.
Let's talk about public inquiries and the purpose of them. They are supposed to be there to thoroughly, rigorously investigate why things happened, draw up recommendations and, ensure things like that don't happen again. However, public inquiries, I'm quoting here, risk becoming pointless as they're now viewed as a way to kick difficult issues into the long grass. If we think about what happened at the post office, Grenfell Tower, the infected blood scandal, this is Lord Norton of Louth claimed the value of public inquiries was just diminished because ministers are only obliged to consider the findings, don't have to explain why recommendations weren't implemented. Do you think there is a risk that public inquiries actually don't do what they're intended to?
Yes, I think so. Although that begs the question, what do you want from them, right? And so I suppose there's a difference between a fact-finding inquiry, when you're trying to understand what exactly has happened and how we got here, and one in which you are trying to find a particular solution to an issue, right? I suppose diagnosis and sort of prescription, so to speak, are different things. I think Lord Norton talks a bit about public inquiries losing trust, and he says that they often are used as a way of delaying action on a controversial issue. He talks a bit about the costs that are associated with them. So I think the Bloody Sunday inquiry costs just over 270 million. Of course, the COVID inquiry, which is going to last, I think, ongoing, but going to last until just after 2030. All the people that were in post making decisions during the pandemic will probably have moved on from them, right? If you look at the ministers that were in place, certainly a lot of them moved on in July last year. So I suppose if you're trying to make the state better, if you're trying to increase performance, then I think it's a difficult it's a difficult thing to try and do. But I think he also calls, or there are a few that are calling for reform. So they are talking about referring for prosecution as a potential power that you could give to public inquiries, therefore giving them a bit of teeth, letting them
toughen them up.
Account.
Yeah, because right now he says, look, there's sort of a bun fight for lawyers that go on for years. It's undermining public trust. So how do you reform the system so you can instill trust? I mean, otherwise that they are fruitless.
Yeah, and I agree, right? I think the referral for prosecution is one good idea, but I think, frankly, we have too many of these. I think it's an easy solution. As soon as you have an issue, you say we'll have a public inquiry into it, and that sort of kicks it away for a few years. And by the time the public inquiry comes back to reporting, well, whoever was in charge when the issue started isn't around anymore, so it isn't so fast.
In the Mail this morning, they are reporting that Nigel Farage is going to make a speech later on today, is going to say a reform government would allow coal mines to reopen in Wales, really pitching, to voters there that Nigel Farage thinks would support the cause of Reform UK. Do you think this is a sort of a savvy strategy from Nigel Farage?
So I don't think so, no. I think it's quite a naked play for working class voters in Wales, a lot of them in traditional Labour heartlands. I think reform would struggle to actually reopen these in the sense that, economically speaking, the business case just isn't there. And so you get to a place where either the state opens them and you end up subsidizing the extraction of coal, which, I mean, if that's where you think the future of our economy is, then I suppose good luck to you. But either you end up subsidizing it or nothing actually happens at all, right? Because a number of businesses would look at an opportunity like this and say, actually, you can't really make much money here. So I think the plan focuses on supporting the Port Talbot steelworks and the coal mines in nearby valleys, but I don't think the reform sums on this quite add up.
Yeah, well, as ever with reform, actually doing the sums is the next part. There's sort of the pitch and the policy idea, and then actually, getting the calculator out and think, how does all this work a little bit later? They will say, to put their side across, that, they've got ways of knowing how they're going to fund these things. But yes, you're right to raise that. Today, there are 21 schools that are going to do something quite unusual and send parenting advice to parents. This is 21 schools in South London. They're going to give really strict guidelines on what they think children should be doing in terms of screen time at home. It's going to be sent to the parents of more than 11,000 children. It's appropriate screen limits. They say up to 18 months old, you should only be on a screen for 5 minutes a day. Year 3 to year 5, 3 hours. Year 10 to 11, 5 hours a day. Do you think we need tougher interventions from our schools to parents to say, actually, look, we see an awful lot of time with your children and we don't want to see the negative effects of them being glued to their phones, iPads, tablets, TVs?
So I think schools can encourage the right behaviour in these kinds of circumstances. I think it's great that they're taking this kind of stance. I think in general, when you look at the effect that overexposure or too much time on social media or on phones, on tech devices, whatever it is that young people spend, I think you look at that and you can see it's negatively correlated with basically every health measure. I think the problem that you get into, however, is that the kids are almost always more tech savvy than the parents, right? So stuff like this tends to be destined to fail. I think what you can do is exposure to sport. So if you sort of get kids playing sport when they're younger, if you get them to keep doing that for a bit, then I think you get many of the benefits that bans or limits on phone time don't really end up achieving. Because the truth is, at every point where some child will grow up and get the choice, they will choose either to spend some time behind their phone, online, on social media, or they'll get up and sort of live in the real world, right? And I think at some point they have to make that choice. You want to make them or put them in the strongest position as possible to make that choice. And I think the way you do that is by exposing them to sport, getting them to play. I love a bit of rugby. I was playing rugby.
Well, what they're saying is,
weekend.
Yeah, giving them toys rather than a screen, in a buggy. We must all see that, out on public transport, whatever it might be, a child that's watching something rather than playing with something. And so they're just trying to kind of give reminders. The schools also, in credit to them, are saying, look, we're going to model this as well, and we're only going to set homework that has to be done electronically unless there is a absolutely sort of educational justification. So they are telling parents they're going to practice what they preach as well. If you're one of the parents that get that letter, or your grandchildren do as well today. Final thing. I am definitely related to one of these. The headline in the Times says, vegetarians are more power hungry than meat eaters. And they're trying to look at why. They're saying vegetarians, as it turns out, are not just keen on saving the planet. They'd quite like to run it too. Why might this be the case, Nathaniel?
So it's funny, they say vegetarians value social status less and value social status more, rather, and are less keen on kindness and conformity. I don't know. You skip out the bacon and it makes you power hungry. I'm not too sure about that. But look, I think for a long time, vegetarian and vegan diets have been seen as a social thing. It's sort of been quite trendy for people to say that they're vegetarian or vegan, particularly when they sort of put ethical reasons behind it. I think it's only about 6% of people who are actually vegetarian, maybe 3% who are vegan. But yeah, I think it's often often a social thing as opposed to anything else.
Nathaniel, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure going through the papers together.